is still a profoundly moving statement of our values. It has never been more relevant than it is now.
The most unsettling royal moments rarely begin with ceremony. They begin with a sentence spoken quietly, behind closed doors, before the public understands that anything has changed. Now, reports surrounding King Charles III have raised one extraordinary question. Has the monarch reached the point where duty itself requires him to step away? The claim circulating through royal commentary is dramatic, that Charles has privately acknowledged he can no longer carry the full burden of leadership, and that preparations for a possible transfer of power are being examined. Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed that an abdication is underway, and no official constitutional announcement has been made. Yet the suggestion alone has been enough to transform every royal appearance, every altered engagement, and every carefully worded palace statement into part of a much larger conversation. Because abdication is not simply retirement. For a British sovereign, leaving the throne before death would represent a profound constitutional and emotional rupture. It would immediately move Prince William, the Prince of Wales, from heir preparing for an eventual future into the central figure around whom the monarchy's next chapter would be organized. Catherine, Princess of Wales, would face a similar transformation, stepping closer to a role she has spent years approaching with discipline, caution, and an understanding that public confidence cannot be demanded, it must be earned. But was this reported development really triggered by one moment of exhaustion, or has pressure been building for far longer than the public realized? King Charles III spent most of his life waiting to become monarch. During those decades, he developed strong views on the environment, architecture, interfaith relations, rural communities, and the responsibilities of public service. Yet the role he eventually inherited was not simply the position he had imagined from a distance. The crown carries relentless constitutional duties, national expectations, family tensions, and the demand that personal difficulty remain invisible whenever the institution requires reassurance. That burden is especially complicated because Charles did not begin his reign as a young man. He inherited a monarchy still shaped by the extraordinary longevity of Queen Elizabeth II, whose presence had become inseparable from the public understanding of stability. The new king therefore faced two challenges at once, preserving continuity while also establishing an identity that could not simply imitate his mother's. At first, the transition appeared carefully controlled. Prince William assumed greater responsibility. Catherine continued building her public role around early childhood, family support, and national service. Queen Camilla stood beside the king as both consort and long-term companion. Princess and the Princess Royal remained one of the family's most reliable working members, carrying out duties with the quiet consistency for which she has long been respected. Yet beneath that public structure was a more sensitive reality. The monarchy was already moving toward generational change, even if no one expected that movement to accelerate suddenly. Some royal watchers believe that this is the hidden significance behind the current speculation. The central question may not be whether Charles wishes to abandon duty, but whether he fears that remaining under overwhelming pressure could eventually weaken the institution he is sworn to protect. In that interpretation, stepping aside would not be an escape from responsibility. It would be presented as a final exercise of it. But that explanation creates another difficulty. If a monarch concludes that the crown must pass forward, when should the heir be told? At the first moment of doubt, when nothing is certain? Or only after advisors have examined the constitutional consequences, and the decision can no longer be reversed? For Prince William, that difference would be deeply personal. The future king has prepared throughout his life for the throne, but preparation is not the same as readiness. He has also worked to protect a measure of normality for Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, knowing that each child will experience the monarchy differently. George is directly in the line of succession. Charlotte and Louis will grow up beside that responsibility, carrying public expectations without ever holding the same constitutional position. An accelerated transition would therefore affect far more than William's diary. It would change the rhythm of the Wales family's life, the visibility of their children, and the balance between private parenthood and national duty. Catherine would not simply be supporting her husband through a professional promotion. She would be helping him absorb the emotional weight of becoming sovereign while ensuring that their family did not disappear beneath the institution. And this is where the story becomes more complicated. Queen Camilla's position would also enter uncertain territory. Her public identity is tied closely to Charles's reign, and any serious discussion of abdication would inevitably raise questions about her future duties, residence, patronages, and influence. Would she continue serving in a limited public capacity? Would she withdraw beside her husband? Or would palace planners seek a clearer separation between the outgoing royal household and the court formed around William and Catherine? None of those questions has been officially answered, but each carries emotional consequences. Camilla endured decades of public hostility before eventually being accepted as queen. If Charles were to leave the throne, she might view the transition not merely as a constitutional adjustment, but as the abrupt ending of an identity she struggled for years to establish. At the same time, William would face pressure to ensure that the next reign began without competing centers of authority. Was this about family loyalty or about protecting the institution from uncertainty? Princess, and could become especially important in such a moment. The king's sister occupies a position of unusual trust, senior enough to understand the crown's internal pressures, yet removed from any personal ambition to inherit it. Royal commentators often describe, and as a figure of continuity, someone capable of speaking directly when others are constrained by emotion, image, or rivalry. Her role, however, would not remove the central tension. Charles would still remain king until any lawful transfer was completed, while William would increasingly become the figure toward whom future expectations were directed. That overlap could create a strange and delicate period in which one reign had not ended, yet another had already begun forming in the public imagination. Every engagement would be interpreted differently. Every absence would invite speculation. Every appearance by William and Catherine would be studied for signs of preparation, while every statement from Charles would be examined for the language of farewell. And perhaps that is why this story has captured such attention. It is not simply about whether one man remains on a throne. It is about when service becomes sacrifice, when continuity requires change, and whether a family can transfer immense power without allowing private wounds to shape the future of the monarchy. Yet one question remains unanswered. What could have happened behind palace doors to make the possibility of abdication feel urgent now? Because if the reports are even partly accurate, this decision did not begin with a public announcement. It began with a moment of private recognition, and understanding that moment may reveal why the crown's next chapter is arriving sooner than anyone expected. That private recognition, if it truly occurred, would have set in motion something far more complex than a single announcement. A monarch cannot simply decide one evening that the burden has become too great and walk away the following morning. The crown is surrounded by constitutional procedure, legal continuity, public expectation, and the memory of what happened the last time a British king voluntarily surrendered the throne. The shadow of Edward VIII still hangs over any discussion of abdication. His departure in 1936 was not remembered as an orderly administrative adjustment, but as a crisis that forced his younger brother, George VI, into a role he had never expected to inherit. The consequences reshaped the royal family for generations, influencing the life of Queen Elizabeth II and creating a lasting belief inside the institution that abdication carries wounds no legal document can fully contain. Charles would understand that history better than almost anyone. For that reason, royal commentators believe any genuine consideration of abdication would be approached with extraordinary caution. Advisors would need to examine how authority could be transferred without suggesting panic, instability, or division. Public statements would have to reassure the country that the monarchy remained functional, while private arrangements would need to address the future of every senior member of the household. But the most difficult challenge would not necessarily be legal. It would be timing. William has spent decades preparing for kingship, yet his preparation has unfolded gradually through military service, charitable work, state occasions, overseas tours, and increasing constitutional responsibility. A sudden acceleration would deny him the final stage of that preparation. Instead of inheriting after a long period of adjustment, he could find himself required to form a new court, establish national priorities, reassure Commonwealth realms, and define the tone of his reign while still processing the personal meaning of his father's departure. That raises a sensitive question. Could the institution prepare for William's future without making him feel that decisions about his life had been taken before he was fully included? Reports suggest that transition planning within royal households is normally treated as a matter of continuity rather than alarm. Senior officials must be prepared for every constitutional possibility. Yet if discussions had moved beyond routine planning into a serious timetable, the emotional significance would change completely. What appeared to advisors as responsible preparation might feel to the heir like a future being organized around him before he had been given the opportunity to respond. And if William believed important decisions were made without his knowledge, the tension would not simply be between monarch and successor. It would be between father and son. The distinction matters because the royal family has often survived by keeping personal emotion separate from public duty. Disagreement may exist behind palace walls, but the image presented outside is one of order, restraint, and continuity. An abdication discussion would place enormous pressure on that separation. William could understand the constitutional logic while still feeling personally excluded. Charles could believe he was protecting his son while unintentionally creating the impression that he trusted palace machinery more than his own family. Was secrecy necessary to preserve stability, or could it become the very thing that damaged trust? Catherine's influence would be especially significant in that moment. Her public style has long depended on steadiness rather than confrontation, and observers would likely look to her as a source of emotional balance. She would need to support her husband without appearing impatient for the crown, while also protecting their children from the sudden attention surrounding the succession. That balance would be extraordinarily delicate. Any increase in the couple's visibility could be interpreted as evidence that a transfer was imminent. Any attempt to maintain a normal schedule might be described as denial. Even a routine appearance could become a symbol of preparation, with clothing, body language, positioning, and public remarks examined for meanings that may never have been intended. The children would face a quieter but equally important change. George's constitutional future would move closer. Charlotte and Louis would become more closely associated with the immediate family of a reigning monarch. Their education, security, public appearances, and private routines could all attract greater scrutiny. For parents who have repeatedly tried to give their children stability, the loss of time might be one of the hardest consequences to accept. Yet the Wales family would not be the only household confronting uncertainty. Camilla's future would require careful definition because the wife of a reigning monarch occupies a different position from the wife of a former king. Her charitable commitments, public role, staff, residences, and ceremonial precedents could all require reconsideration. Some observers may see that as a straightforward consequence of succession. For Camilla, however, it could represent something much more personal. Her path into the center of royal life was long, controversial, and marked by intense public criticism. Becoming queen was not simply a change of title, it was the final stage of a public transformation that had taken decades. If Charles were now preparing to step aside, would she regard his decision as an act of sacrifice, or as a choice that ended their shared role without allowing her to shape what came next? Buckingham Palace has not confirmed any such dispute, and claims of private disagreement remain unverified. Still, the possibility reveals why abdication could affect relationships far beyond the line of succession. Each royal figure would hear the same decision differently. Charles might view it as protection. William might experience it as an unavoidable summons. Catherine might see the need for restraint. Camilla could feel that the identity built around the current reign was being quietly dismantled. Princess Anne's position could become more influential precisely because she stands outside those competing emotions. Her reputation for directness, discipline, and loyalty would make her a natural bridge between households. She could help preserve public unity while reminding family members that the institution cannot afford visible resentment during a transfer of power. But even and could not solve the larger strategic problem. A monarchy preparing for transition would need to avoid the appearance of two competing centers of authority. Charles would remain sovereign until any constitutional process was completed. William, meanwhile, would become the person around whom future decisions increasingly gathered. Staff might begin seeking his opinion. Organizations could reconsider which royal patron best represented their future. Government officials and Commonwealth leaders might quietly prepare for a new monarch while continuing to serve the existing one. Nothing would have officially changed, yet almost everything would begin to feel different. That uncertain space between one reign and the next could be more dangerous than the final announcement itself. A delayed transition might fuel speculation. A rushed transition could appear chaotic. Too much secrecy could weaken trust, while too much disclosure could make Charles seem like a monarch whose authority had already begun to fade. And then there is the question of public interpretation. Would the country see abdication as weakness, or as a responsible decision by a king placing continuity above pride? Older viewers may remember how deeply Queen Elizabeth II believed in lifelong service. Others may argue that modern leadership should include the wisdom to recognize personal limits. The palace would therefore be managing not only a constitutional process, but a national debate over what duty truly means. Yet behind that debate, another concern would be growing. Because once the possibility of abdication entered serious conversation, the question would no longer be simply whether Charles could continue. It would become who was already preparing for the authority, influence, and position that his departure would leave behind, and whether everyone inside the royal household accepted the future taking shape around William. And that uncertainty may be the clearest sign that the reported abdication discussion is not simply about one king reaching the limits of his strength. It may also reveal a deeper struggle over how the monarchy intends to survive the next generation and who will be permitted to shape that survival. For years, the royal family has attempted to present succession as a smooth and almost automatic process. The sovereign serves, the heir prepares, and the institution continues. Yet behind that simple public image lies a far more complicated reality. Every reign develops its own network of advisors, loyalties, charitable interests, household traditions, and personal relationships. When a monarch leaves, those structures do not vanish immediately. Some are transferred, others are reduced, and a few may resist being displaced at all. If reports of advanced transition planning are accurate, William would not merely inherit his father's constitutional responsibilities. He would also need to decide which parts of the existing royal system should continue and which must change. That distinction could explain why the atmosphere surrounding the succession has begun to feel more sensitive. The Prince of Wales has often signaled a preference for a smaller, more focused monarchy, one that demonstrates value through visible service rather than relying entirely on ceremony and inherited prestige. Charles, by contrast, spent decades developing a broad network of causes, foundations, advisors, and long-standing personal commitments. These approaches are not necessarily in conflict, but once a transition becomes immediate, differences in style can quickly become questions of authority. Which charities would retain royal patronage? Which offices would be absorbed into the new household? Which advisors would remain influential, and which would quietly leave? Even decisions that appeared administrative could be interpreted as judgments on the outgoing reign. This is where Queen Camilla's position becomes strategically important. Her influence has largely existed through proximity to Charles, shared public duties, and the personal trust of the reigning monarch. Under William, that connection would change. She could remain respected as a senior member of the family, while no longer occupying the same place at the center of decision-making. Some royal observers have suggested that any future arrangement would need to protect her dignity without creating the impression that the previous court continued to operate beside the new one. Buckingham Palace has not confirmed that such negotiations are taking place, but the institutional logic is difficult to ignore. A new sovereign must be seen to govern his own household. For William, however, establishing independence would involve considerable risk. Move too quickly, and he could appear eager to remove those connected to his father. Proceed too cautiously, and the new reign might begin under the influence of structures he did not design. The future king would therefore need to separate necessary reform from personal resentment, even while the emotional wounds created by secrecy remained unresolved. Catherine's role could once again become central, though perhaps not in the way many expect. Her importance would not come only from public appearances or ceremonial status. It could come from helping determine the moral tone of the transition. Would the next reign begin with visible distance from Charles and Camilla, or with a carefully managed display of continuity? Would William emphasize change, or would he first reassure the public that his father's service remained respected? Catherine's instinct for measured symbolism could influence how those choices were understood. A photograph, a shared engagement, or even the order in which family members appeared at a national ceremony might carry greater meaning than any formal statement. The Princess Royal would face a different responsibility. Anne's loyalty to her brother is well established, but so is her commitment to the crown as an institution larger than any individual. If tension emerged between the king's current household and William's future court, she might be one of the few figures capable of understanding both sides without appearing to seek advantage. Yet that position could also place her under pressure. Supporting Charles emotionally might be interpreted as resistance to change. Advising William could be seen as abandoning her brother. Remaining silent could allow distrust to deepen. Was Anne protecting the monarch, the heir, or the institution itself? Perhaps the answer would be all three, even when those loyalties no longer pointed in exactly the same direction. Prince Edward could also become more significant during such a transition. His public role has generally been quieter, but stability often depends on figures who can carry duties without drawing conflict toward themselves. As senior responsibilities shifted, Edward might be expected to support continuity, while William and Catherine focused on the constitutional demands of succession. This reveals another hidden consequence of abdication. The burden would not move from one person to another. It would spread across the entire working royal family. Calendars would be reorganized. Patronages could change hands. Overseas visits might be postponed or reassigned. Public expectations would rise immediately, even before the new reign had established its rhythm. The monarchy could appear calm on television while undergoing one of the most demanding internal reorganizations in modern royal history. And public reaction would shape every decision. Supporters of Charles might view significant reforms as a rejection of his legacy. Admirers of William could demand faster modernization. Critics of the institution would question whether the transition changed anything substantial at all. Meanwhile, the palace would be expected to present unity without allowing that unity to feel staged. The contradiction is striking. To survive, the monarchy must change. But to remain trusted, it must make change appear continuous. Some commentators believe this tension has defined the House of Windsor for generations. The institution presents permanence while constantly adapting behind the scenes. Titles evolve, households shrink, public duties shift, and family members are repositioned according to the needs of the crown. What appears timeless is often the result of careful and sometimes painful adjustment. A possible abdication would expose that machinery more clearly than usual. It would also raise a question no palace statement could easily answer. When does protecting the future become an attempt to control it? Charles might wish to ensure that William inherits stability rather than disorder. Yet any conditions placed upon the transition could limit the new king's freedom. William might seek independence, but too much distance could deepen the perception that his father had been pushed aside. Camilla might defend the dignity of the current reign, while others could interpret that defense as resistance to the authority forming around the heir. These competing motives do not require villains. They require people facing the same event from profoundly different positions. That may be the most revealing part of the story. The pressure was no longer centered on whether Charles would remain sovereign. It was shifting toward the terms under which he might leave, and who had already begun influencing those terms. Because beneath the constitutional language, the careful scheduling, and the public expressions of loyalty, one development was reportedly beginning to change the emotional balance inside the family. And if that development is understood correctly, it could reveal not only why the transition accelerated, but who recognized the true consequences before everyone else did. The figure who may have understood the consequences earliest was Princess Anne. Not because she stood to inherit greater authority, and not because she had any interest in influencing the next reign, but because she had spent decades watching the monarchy survive moments when private emotion threatened to become public instability. According to some royal commentators, the Princess Royal's importance in any serious transition would come from her ability to recognize danger before it became visible. She understands that royal crises rarely begin with dramatic announcements. They begin with altered schedules, uncertain instructions, divided loyalties, and small decisions that suddenly reveal where power is moving. If Anne detected that pattern, her concern may not have been whether Charles would ultimately step aside. It may have been whether the family could reach that moment without appearing fractured. Buckingham Palace has not confirmed reports of internal transition discussions, and there is no verified evidence that Anne has been formally asked to mediate between royal households. Yet observers have speculated that the king's sister would be among the few people capable of speaking honestly to Charles, while also reminding William that the crown cannot be inherited through resentment. That role would become especially important if the reported preparations had already started affecting daily royal operations. A change in responsibility does not require a public decree to become noticeable. Senior staff may begin requesting additional guidance from the heir's household. Long-term engagements might be reviewed before commitments are confirmed. Charitable organizations could quietly seek reassurance about future patronage. Government officials would continue observing constitutional form while privately considering how quickly a transfer of duties could be completed. Each action might appear routine in isolation. Together, they could create the impression that the monarchy was already reorganizing itself around William. That would place Charles in an increasingly difficult position. The king could remain sovereign in law while feeling that the institution had begun preparing for his absence. Every attempt to prove that he remained capable might be interpreted as resistance. Every reduced appearance could strengthen speculation that his departure was approaching. The contradiction would become impossible to ignore. To protect the monarchy, Charles might need to demonstrate stability. But the harder he tried to demonstrate it, the more the public might wonder why such reassurance had become necessary. And then came the wider question of perception. Modern royal authority depends less on direct political power than on public trust, symbolism, and continuity. A monarch can fulfill every constitutional requirement and still face difficulty if the nation begins to believe that leadership has become uncertain. That is why palace communication would matter as much as legal procedure. One poorly judged phrase could make abdication sound like collapse. One overly polished statement could appear evasive. Silence might preserve privacy for a time, but it could also allow speculation to become more persuasive than the official account. Was the palace protecting the king by saying little, or allowing the absence of information to define him? Reports suggest that concern about the monarchy's future image may have encouraged advisors to consider not only how a transition would occur, but how it would be remembered. Charles would not want his reign reduced to a story of exhaustion. William could not allow his accession to appear connected to pressure placed upon his father. Camilla would need reassurance that the public dignity of the outgoing court would be preserved, while Catherine would be expected to represent calm without appearing to anticipate the Queen's position. Those interests could not all be managed through one announcement. The turning point may therefore have come when the issue moved beyond whether Charles personally wished to continue and became a question of whether uncertainty itself was beginning to damage the crown. If that interpretation is correct, the palace would have faced a strategic choice. Delay any decision and risk months of escalating questions, conflicting reports, and constant examination of the king's condition. Move quickly and face accusations that the transition had been arranged before the public was given an honest explanation. Neither path offered complete protection. William's response would become decisive. The Prince of Wales could not simply accept a timetable created around him. He would need to establish the terms under which he was willing to inherit, including how his father would be treated, how Camilla's future would be defined, and how the family would present unity without denying the strain beneath it. Some observers believe his greatest concern would be preventing the new reign from beginning with the appearance of victory over the old one. That calculation would not be only emotional, it would be institutional. A monarchy built upon continuity cannot afford to portray succession as a contest in which one household defeats another. Catherine's influence might be felt most strongly here. She would understand that the public would judge the transition through human details as much as constitutional language. A visible gesture of respect toward Charles could soften the impression of removal. A shared appearance involving both households could suggest continuity. Yet if such moments felt excessively managed, they might create the opposite reaction. Royal symbolism works only when it appears natural. Camilla's choices would also carry greater weight than before. If she withdrew from public view, commentators might interpret the absence as grief, anger, or exclusion. If she remained highly visible, critics could claim she was resisting the transfer of influence. The same action could therefore produce two entirely different stories depending on who was watching. This is how private tension becomes public meaning, not through confirmed arguments or leaked conversations, but through interpretation. The monarchy lives inside that space, where gestures become evidence and silence becomes language. Then there was the historical risk Charles could not escape. Edward VIII's abdication left behind a narrative of personal desire overwhelming public duty. For Charles, the challenge would be to create the opposite understanding, that leaving, if he chose to do so, was an act designed to preserve duty before personal strain weakened it. But history is rarely controlled by intention alone. The public would decide whether they saw courage or failure. Supporters might describe the decision as selfless. Critics could argue that a monarch who waited a lifetime should have been prepared for the role. Others might question whether William was truly ready, regardless of how carefully the palace presented the transition. The Commonwealth realms would also watch closely. Any change at the center of the monarchy could revive debates about the crown's relevance in countries where constitutional ties are already being reconsidered. What appeared to be a family and national matter could therefore carry consequences far beyond Britain. That possibility would make the timing even more consequential. The palace would not simply be transferring a title. It would be testing whether the institution could change leaders without weakening the symbolic bonds that still connected it to millions of people. And this may have been the strongest turning point of all, the moment when remaining undecided became more dangerous than making a decision. If Charles had truly reached that conclusion, then the reported words, "I can no longer lead," would not have represented the beginning of the crisis. They would have marked the end of a much longer internal struggle. Yet even then, one question would remain at the center of everything. Would stepping aside protect the monarchy Charles had spent his life serving, or would the manner of his departure expose divisions that the crown could no longer keep hidden? Because the final consequence was not merely who would sit on the throne next. It was whether this transition would be remembered as a dignified act of duty, a painful admission of human limits, or the moment the royal family revealed how profoundly the balance of power had already changed. That question may ultimately determine how this chapter of King Charles III's reign is remembered. If the reports of an approaching abdication prove accurate, history will not judge the decision only by the fact that a monarch stepped aside. It will judge whether the departure preserved confidence, protected the succession, and allowed the royal family to move forward without turning a constitutional transition into a visible family reckoning. The difference would lie in the manner of the transfer. A carefully managed transition could present Charles as a sovereign who recognized that service is not measured only by endurance. In that interpretation, stepping away would become an act of restraint, the decision of a king unwilling to let personal pride create uncertainty around the crown. It would not erase the difficulties of his reign, but it could shape his final legacy around responsibility rather than decline. Yet the palace would need to make that meaning credible. Buckingham Palace could not simply declare that the transition represented sacrifice and expect the public to accept the explanation without question. Viewers would watch the king's final appearances, the tone of any national address, and the way William spoke about his father. They would notice whether Charles appeared included in the family's future or quietly removed from its center. They would also observe whether the outgoing and incoming households seemed united or merely disciplined enough to conceal their differences. That distinction would matter because a monarchy does not survive through procedure alone. It survives through the stories people believe about it. If Charles were seen as being pressured from the throne, the transition could leave suspicion around William's accession. If the king appeared unwilling to leave, uncertainty could overshadow the beginning of the next reign. But if father and son presented the decision together, acknowledging both its necessity and its emotional cost, the moment might be remembered as a rare example of personal difficulty being placed beneath institutional duty. William's first challenge would therefore not be to demonstrate power. It would be to demonstrate character. The future monarch would need to establish authority without humiliating the man whose authority he inherited. He would need to modernize the royal household without suggesting that everything connected to his father had become outdated. Most importantly, he would have to show that the crown could pass between generations without repeating the resentment, isolation, and unresolved wounds that have followed previous royal transitions. Catherine's position would carry equal symbolic importance. Her calm public presence could help reassure those who fear that change is arriving too quickly. Yet she would also represent the future, and every increase in her responsibility would remind the public that the center of royal life had shifted toward the Wales family. The challenge would be to allow that shift to appear natural. Too much visibility could make William and Catherine seem impatient. Too little could raise doubts about their preparedness. Their early decisions would therefore need to communicate readiness without celebration, confidence without triumph, and reform without rejection. For Camilla, the meaning of the transition could be more personal. Her future might no longer be defined by influence at the heart of the reigning court, but by the dignity with which she accompanied Charles into a quieter role. Some observers may expect her to reduce her public duties considerably. Others may argue that selected charitable work would preserve continuity while making clear that the next household belonged to William and Catherine. Whatever arrangement emerged, it would reveal how the monarchy intends to treat those whose public authority ends before their lives of service do. That question reaches beyond one queen consort. It touches the institution's wider relationship with loyalty. Royal service has traditionally demanded complete commitment, but the crown has not always known how to create meaningful places for those who move away from its center. A dignified settlement for Charles and Camilla could therefore become part of a broader effort to prevent former senior figures from appearing discarded, resentful, or tempted to create influence outside the official court. Princess, and would remain one of the strongest symbols of continuity. She would not need a new title or an expanded public campaign to demonstrate her importance. Her value would lie in consistency, in carrying duties while others adjusted to changing roles, and in reminding the family that stability often depends upon those who continue working while attention is focused elsewhere. Edward's role could grow for the same reason. A smaller monarchy would place greater pressure on every dependable working royal, particularly during the early months of a new reign. The transfer of the crown might happen in one legal moment, but the redistribution of responsibility would continue for years. That is why this reported development matters far beyond the immediate question of abdication. It could accelerate a transformation already taking place within the House of Windsor. The monarchy of the future may be more concentrated around the sovereign, the heir, and a limited number of senior working royals. Public engagements may become more selective. Patronages could be reduced or reorganized. The institution may place greater emphasis on measurable service, national relevance, and visible responsibility. But a smaller monarchy also carries greater risk. With fewer people representing the crown, illness, controversy, or family disagreement becomes harder to absorb. Every senior figure carries more weight, and every absence becomes more noticeable. Streamlining may improve clarity, but it can also reduce the flexibility that once allowed the institution to withstand pressure. William would inherit that contradiction. He may seek a monarchy that appears more modern and accountable, yet he would also need to preserve the traditions that give the crown its meaning. The public may support reform while still expecting ceremony. They may demand openness while continuing to value mystery. They may want royals to appear human, but judge them harshly when human vulnerability becomes visible. Charles's possible departure would sit directly inside that contradiction. His reign could end not because the institution rejected him, but because the demands placed upon a modern monarch had become impossible to separate from the person carrying them. If so, the deeper lesson would be uncomfortable. The crown may symbolize permanence, but every sovereign remains human, subject to exhaustion, uncertainty, family pressure, and the passage of time. Perhaps that truth would not weaken the monarchy. Perhaps acknowledging it could make the institution more credible. Royal observers will now watch for the details that indicate whether speculation is becoming reality. Changes to official schedules, a greater concentration of duties around William, unusual joint appearances, carefully chosen language from senior family members, or any formal clarification from Buckingham Palace. Until such confirmation arrives, the central claims remain unverified, and the final direction of the story cannot be treated as settled. Still, the discussion has already revealed something important. The future of the monarchy is no longer a distant question waiting for another generation. It is being shaped now through decisions about duty, dignity, succession, and the limits of royal service. And while this chapter may be moving toward an answer, the wider transformation inside the House of Windsor is far from complete. Was this simply the difficult end of one reign, or evidence that the balance of authority is changing more quickly than the public has been told? Because as attention remains fixed on Charles and William, another development elsewhere in the royal family is beginning to raise its own questions, and it may reveal just how widely the pressure surrounding the crown has already spread.